The email arrived at 11:47 a.m. on a Wednesday in March, and I almost deleted it thinking it was spam. The subject line read simply, "Senior Vice President role, congratulations." I remember the exact time because I glanced at my watch, a habit I developed over the past 15 years at Whitmore Financial, a habit born from the certainty that time was the only thing I couldn't get back. At 52 years old, my entire body felt heavier than it should have, as if gravity had become more insistent with each passing year, and the weight of that single email somehow added another 10 pounds to my shoulders. I didn't open it immediately. Instead, I sat there in my corner office on the 42nd floor, looking out at the city sprawling beneath me like it had always been mine to survey, and I thought about Thomas Chun. Thomas was 34 years old, brilliant in that way that made older men like me feel like dinosaurs, with the kind of energy that hadn't yet been beaten out of him by 2 decades of corporate compromise. He'd been hired 18 months ago with a salary that made me wince. The new generation always started too high, always seemed to skip the suffering that had built my own career step by careful, agonizing step. But here's the thing about being 52. You start to recognize patterns, the way a forest fire recognizes old wood. You see the future in younger people's faces. You watch them climb and you remember what it felt like to climb, and you know it's over for you. The climbing is done. Whatever promotion came now would be the last significant one, and I both craved it and feared it in the way you fear your own death certificate arriving in the mail. Inevitable, necessary, but definitive in a way that nothing else is. When I finally opened that email, my hands were shaking. David Rothstein, the CEO, had personally signed off on it. "Your strategic vision and unwavering commitment have made you invaluable to our organization," he wrote. Every word felt like a stone placed carefully on top of another stone, building something that could collapse at any moment. Senior Vice President of Operations. It was what I'd been chasing since I was 37 years old. When I first accepted a middle management position at Whitmore and told my ex-wife Sandra that this was it, this was my breakthrough moment. Sandra had smiled at me then in a way I now understand was pity. She's a therapist, and she has this expression patient, knowing, slightly removed, that she would use whenever I made declarations about the future. "That's wonderful, Harrison," she would say, and I could hear the subtext. "We'll see if this one sticks, or if you'll be disappointed again. We divorced 3 years ago, and I haven't seen her in person since the mediation. Our son, Michael, calls occasionally from Portland, where he's decided to build his life far away from the city where I'd built mine." I called my boss immediately. Rebecca Winters, the current SVP, picked up on the second ring. "Harrison," she said, and her voice had something in it I couldn't quite identify. Relief? Resignation? I'm not good at reading tones anymore. Maybe I never was. "Have you seen the email?" I asked her, the question feeling stupid the moment it left my mouth. Of course she'd seen it. Everyone would have seen it within hours. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, that kind of silence that corporate people become expert at, the silence that communicates everything while saying nothing. "Congratulations," she finally said, and the word landed like a stone thrown into still water. "I think you're going to find the job is different than you expected." I remember thinking that was an odd thing to say, almost a warning. I remember thinking I should ask her what she meant, but I didn't. Instead, I thanked her and told her I looked forward to working together in the new structure, and she laughed, actually laughed, in a way that sounded like breaking glass. "Yeah," she said, "we'll see about that." That should have been my first indication that something was wrong. Not wrong in a universal sense, but wrong in that specific way that middle-aged men recognize too late, when the warning signs have been there all along, but we've been too busy climbing to look down at the ground beneath us. I was about to learn that the promotion I'd waited 32 years for half my life, literally half, was going to destroy everything I'd built during those same 32 years. I was about to learn that what I'd mistaken for loyalty and competence had actually been invisibility and convenience. I was about to learn that there's a specific age at which organizations stop valuing you and start using you. And the line between those two things is so thin you can't see it until you've already crossed over. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong came not from Rothstein or the executive team, but from Thomas Chun. I didn't see it as an indication at first. I saw it as kindness, as the next generation being decent enough to acknowledge their elder. Thomas had always been cordial, in the way younger employees at Whitmore are cordial with older ones. There's a specific choreography to it, the slightly too warm smile, the way they hold your eye contact just a beat too long, the "I really respect what you've done here" compliments that arrive fully formed and perfectly calibrated. They're not being insincere exactly. It's more that they've learned early what took me 30 years to understand. People want to be told they matter, and it costs nothing to say it. Thomas came to my office on my first day as SVP. I was still arranging things, a photograph of Michael as a child, a few books on business strategy, some tchotchke from the past 15 years that I'd meant to throw away but never had. "Sir," he said, and the formality of it made me feel ancient. Nobody had called me sir in years, and suddenly it was everywhere, this tiny word that marked a boundary I hadn't realized had been there. "I wanted to congratulate you personally. The new position is well-deserved." I offered him a chair. My new office was larger than my old one, with better views, though the view hadn't changed because I was still looking at the same city from a slightly higher floor, and we talked for about 20 minutes about the business, about initiatives I'd been involved with, about the quarterly earnings targets that we were all obsessed with hitting. He asked careful questions, genuinely good questions, about the decision-making process behind some of the restructuring I'd overseen 2 years earlier. I answered them thoroughly, enthusiastically even, the way you do when someone seems genuinely interested in your expertise. I showed him spreadsheets and walked him through the logic of why we'd consolidated 3 divisions instead of cutting positions outright. At the end of the conversation, he thanked me again, and as he was leaving, he turned back and said something that should have registered as strange but didn't. "I'm really glad you're in this position. I think you'll bring a different perspective to how we think about operations." I took it as a compliment. Looking back now, 3 months later, I understand it was a reconnaissance mission. He was taking my measurements, metaphorically, the way you might measure a room before deciding whether you could fit your furniture in there. He was determining whether I was, in fact, going to be a problem. The promotion came with a redesigned organizational structure that I should have noticed was designed specifically to limit my actual authority. I noticed it, actually, but I rationalized it, the way you do. The way I'd learned to do over 15 years of climbing. You compromise here to gain there. You accept a smaller team to get a bigger title. You tell yourself the operations part of Senior Vice President of Operations is flexible, that it can be interpreted broadly. You tell yourself you're being strategic by accepting constraints because you're focused on long-term positioning within the company. You lie to yourself with the proficiency of someone who's been practicing that particular deception for decades. My first major meeting with the executive team was a Friday morning. Rothstein, Thomas, Rebecca, Marcus Webb, the CFO, and myself. We were discussing the Q2 operational budget, and I'd prepared extensively. I'd identified areas where we could reduce costs without significantly impacting the service delivery metrics we publicly committed to. Cost reduction was always popular with boards, always popular with shareholders, and I'd spent 20 hours the previous week running scenarios and building models that showed we could save approximately $3.2 million annually by consolidating some of our back-end processing and renegotiating vendor contracts. Thomas had also prepared a presentation. I didn't see it in advance. At Whitmore, the senior team was usually afforded courtesy previews of major presentations, an opportunity to familiarize yourself with the material so there were no surprises in the actual meeting. I got no preview, His presentation outlined a complete operational restructure that, coincidentally, incorporated roughly 70% of my cost reduction ideas, but with one critical modification. He'd removed all the parts that required long-term planning and institutional knowledge and replaced them with what he called dynamic, agile, technology-first solutions that would be overseen by a new position he called Chief Operating Strategy Officer, and it became immediately clear that he was angling for that position himself. The brilliant part, and I have to give him credit for this, even now when giving him credit requires a specific kind of effort, was that his version of my ideas actually looked better. It was sleeker, more modern, less cautious. It had graphics and forward-looking statements about innovation and disruption. My presentation looked, by comparison, like something prepared by a man still thinking in frameworks that belong to a different era of business. Which, of course, I am. A man from a different era. That's what you become at 52, and no amount of keeping up with the times really changes it. You're always behind. The technology is always too new. The language of business is always evolving just slightly faster than your ability to maintain fluency. But here's what I know from 15 years at this company. Before you can eliminate someone's position, you first have to eliminate their credibility. You have to make their ideas seem outdated or poorly thought through. You have to introduce doubt about their judgment. Thomas did this very carefully, without ever saying anything explicitly damning. He just asked questions in the meeting. "Harrison," he said, and I can still hear the exact tone, respectful, curious, not at all hostile, in your model. "You're assuming vendor contracts can be renegotiated with existing providers. But what if we took this as an opportunity to evaluate new market entrants? I've done some preliminary research, and there are several companies offering similar services at significantly lower rates." He wasn't wrong. He was, in fact, probably right. But what he was really saying, what everyone in that room heard underneath the words, was, "Harrison hasn't considered this angle. Harrison is missing something obvious." Rothstein nodded. Marcus Webb made a note. Rebecca, who had been in my position until I took this job, looked at me with that same expression she'd had on the phone. It was pity. The word I should have understood it as was warning, but at the time it just felt like something was slightly off, like a room that's been painted the wrong color and you can't quite figure out why it makes you uncomfortable. After the meeting, Thomas caught me in the hallway. The hallway at Whitmore is lined with glass offices, which means there's always someone watching, always some version of visibility. "Hey," he said, "I hope you didn't feel like I was stepping on your toes in there. That wasn't my intention. I just saw an opportunity to add some additional layers of analysis, and I wanted to make sure it was on the table." His sincerity sounded genuine. His concern seemed authentic. But somewhere in the past 15 years at this company, I'd learned to hear the subtext underneath the words. What he was actually saying was, "I wanted to make sure everyone knows I'm thinking bigger than you are." I told him it was fine. I told him I appreciated the additional perspective. I told him this was the kind of collaborative approach that made Whitmore successful. I was lying, and we both knew it, but the lie was so socially acceptable, so well-rehearsed, that it just flowed out of my mouth like a learned prayer. Later that afternoon, sitting alone in my new larger office with the better views, I realized that something fundamental had changed. I'd been promoted into a position that looked powerful but was actually powerless. And now I was going to spend every meeting watching younger people dismantle my authority with courtesy and collaboration and questions framed as seeking wisdom. The thing about being 52 years old in a corporate environment is that your body starts to betray the daily lies you're telling. I stopped sleeping well around the third week of my new position. I'd go to bed at 10 or 11, and I'd fall asleep easily enough, but then I'd wake up at 3 in the morning with my heart racing, my mind already spinning through scenarios and conversations, picking apart every interaction from the previous day, cataloging every moment where I might have said something differently, handled something more decisively. This is what anxiety looks like when you're pushing 53. It's not panic attacks, which are theatrical and dramatic. It's a low-level, persistent hum of dread that lives underneath everything you do. It's the exhaustion that comes from running a constant internal audit of your own competence. I started going to the gym before work, trying to recapture some version of physical vitality, some proof that I wasn't as old as I felt. But my body at 52 doesn't respond the way it did at 32. The same workout that would have energized me 20 years ago now just leaves me aching. I can feel my joints in a way I never used to. My knees specifically. I've got pain in my left knee that comes and goes, and I've convinced myself it's from my running form changing or from sitting too long at the office, but it's really from aging. That's all it is. The simple accumulation of years catching up with you physically, the way compound interest works in reverse, all your physical capital gradually getting called in until you're overdrawn. My ex-wife Sandra used to say that I didn't allow myself to experience things fully because I was always anticipating the next moment. You're never actually here, she would say, during fights that happened in our kitchen at 7 p.m. with Michael upstairs trying to do his homework and pretend he wasn't listening to his parents fall apart. You're always somewhere else, some hypothetical future that you're convinced is coming. And then it does come. And you're too tired to enjoy it because you're already worrying about what comes next. I told her she was being unfair. I told her I provided, that I worked hard, that I was doing all of this for our family. She said, "Yes, and you're doing it in a way that means none of us get to have you." That was 14 years ago, and I think about it more now than I did when she said it. The first real indication that I was in serious trouble came on a Thursday morning, about a month into my new position. I was in a budget review meeting with Rebecca, Marcus, and Thomas. We were discussing departmental spend, and I noticed something odd in the numbers. One of the divisions under my oversight, or what I thought was my oversight, had allocated $1.2 million for what was listed only as strategic technology initiatives. I asked what that meant. Marcus looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Rebecca. Rebecca looked at her laptop screen like it might suddenly provide a script for her to read from. "Harrison," Rebecca said carefully, "that's part of the new operational structure we discussed. That falls under the Chief Operating Strategy role that Rothstein is still finalizing." What she meant was, you don't actually control that budget anymore, even though it's technically under operations. What she meant was, your actual authority is smaller than your title suggests. I asked what the $1.2 million was being used for specifically. Thomas answered, "Research into automation and process optimization. We're looking at machine learning applications to streamline our back-end operations. It's kind of my wheelhouse, so I've been taking point on it." He said this casually, like it was nothing, like he wasn't describing the slow, systematic dismantling of my new position in real time. I asked when this had been decided. "Last week," Thomas said. "Rothstein asked me to start scoping it out. We presented the preliminary findings to him on Tuesday. 3 days ago, in a meeting I wasn't invited to. I sat there and felt something shift inside my chest, something fundamental in my understanding of the world I'd been working in for 15 years. I was a dinosaur. That was the specific feeling, not just old, but obsolete. The kind of obsolete that comes with a job title but no actual power, with authority that's been hollowed out from the inside so that it looks intact but isn't. I thought about David Rothstein, the CEO who had personally signed the email congratulating me on my promotion. I thought about how he'd elevated me just far enough to sideline me, just high enough that I'd be too proud to complain about being diminished, just visible enough that my absence wouldn't look like a demotion, but rather like a natural consequence of business evolution. "When were you going to tell me?" I asked. I said it quietly, trying to keep my voice professional, but I could hear the edge in it anyway. The edges were getting harder to smooth out. The older you get, the less energy you have for managing your own reactions. "We were going to loop you in next week," Rebecca said. "It's all still very preliminary." What she was saying was, "You're reacting. And now we're going to remember that you're reacting. And that will become part of the narrative about you. That will become the reason that eventually, in some corporate meeting in 6 months or a year, people will nod knowingly when your name comes up because they'll remember this moment when you showed emotion about being excluded. That will be the story they tell about you. Unreliable, insecure, aging out of the corporate world." I asked to be excused and left the meeting. In the bathroom, I locked myself in a stall and stood there for about 5 minutes, just breathing, just trying to manage the specific cocktail of shame and rage that was moving through my system. I was being systematically eliminated from a position I'd been elevated to less than a month prior. The promotion was actually a sophisticated trap, a way to get me out of my old position without firing me. A way to restructure around me while keeping me technically employed and too proud to admit what was happening. When I came back to my office, I found an instant message from David Rothstein asking if I had time for a quick call. This is another thing you learn at 52 in corporate. The most destructive conversations always seem casual. Always ask politely if you have time. Always approach you with deference right before they remove something essential. I called him immediately. His voice when he picked up was warm, almost paternal. "Harrison, how are you settling in?" he asked. I told him I was settling in fine. "Great," he said. "I wanted to just reach out because I got the sense in the meeting today that maybe you weren't feeling entirely informed about the direction we're taking with operations. I should have been clearer with you up front that we're moving into a new era, a new technological paradigm, and we wanted to make sure you were part of that transformation." He was speaking in that specific corporate language that's designed to make bad things sound progressive, to make losses sound like growth. "What does that mean practically?" I asked him. "What's my actual role in this transformation?" There was a pause. Then, "That's a great question. I think your role is to ensure that we're managing the human side of this transition effectively. You understand operations from a people perspective, from an institutional knowledge perspective, and that's incredibly valuable as we move toward more automated systems. You'll essentially be managing the transition, helping people adapt to new workflows, identifying where we need additional training, that sort of thing." What he had just done, very elegantly, was reduce my role from strategic vice president of operations to essentially a change management position. He was demoting me while claiming he was elevating my importance. The role he was describing, managing people through transitions, is typically done by middle managers, not by executives. But he was offering it to me, wrapping it in language that made it sound like I was needed, like I was essential, like I had been given a position of trust. The thing is, I could have pushed back. I could have said, "Actually, David, this doesn't sound like what I was hired for." I could have fought it. But at 52 years old, with a son in his 20s who I haven't really been present for, with an ex-wife who's moved on to a happy relationship with someone else, with 15 years invested in a company that had just shown me its fundamental attitude toward aging employees, I couldn't quite find the will to fight. Or maybe I was afraid. Maybe I'd already started accepting the narrative that this was appropriate, that this was what you get when you've been climbing for 30 years and suddenly realize the only direction available is down. "That sounds fine," I heard myself say. "I'm committed to making this transition successful." What I should have said was, "You've promoted me into a position designed to eliminate my effectiveness. And now you're offering me a role that amounts to managing the grief of people being replaced by systems. I'm not allowed to understand." But I didn't say that. I said, "That sounds fine." After we hung up, I sat in my office in the fading afternoon light and tried to understand exactly what had just happened to my career. I'd been promoted to a position where I had title but no authority, where I was responsible for outcomes I couldn't control, where my actual power had been systematically transferred to a younger person who could do the job better than I could, who understood the technology better than I could, who didn't carry the institutional memory that actually made change harder because it made you aware of all the things that were being lost. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I didn't call my ex-wife, though I thought about it. I didn't call my son, though I considered it. Instead, I just sat with it, this new reality, this new version of my career that looked the same from the outside, but was fundamentally different on the inside. I'd spent so long chasing this promotion 15 years, which is longer than most marriages, longer than many friendships, longer than most people spend at any single job, and it had turned out to be the exact opposite of what I thought it would be. The following weeks fell into a pattern. I'd attend meetings where decisions were made about my areas of responsibility, decisions that I had no input on. I'd receive emails about initiatives I wasn't consulted about. I'd see org charts being redrawn in ways that made my position less central. And through all of it, Thomas was nothing but professional, helpful even. He'd occasionally ask my advice on things. "Harrison, you've been here forever," he'd say, and I'd hear all the layers underneath it. "I'm acknowledging that you're old, and I'm asking you for historical context like you're a museum exhibit." He'd ask me to present at company meetings, to share my perspective on how operations has evolved over the years. And I'd do it because what else was I going to do? Refuse to participate? Make it obvious that I understood what was happening. But here's the thing about understanding what's happening. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once I understood that my position was designed to marginalize me, everything I thought I knew about corporate environments had to be re-examined. The respect I thought I'd earned, was it actual respect? Or was it just the courtesy you extend to people you've already decided to push out? The relationships I'd built with my team, were they genuine, or had they been transactional the whole time? The promotions I'd received in the past, had they been based on merit, or was I just being moved up and around in the organization until I was ready to be forced out? I started keeping a notebook. This is something I'm not particularly proud of, but it's something I did. Every meeting that excluded me, I'd write it down. Every decision made about my areas of responsibility that I wasn't consulted about, I'd note it. Every interaction with Thomas that had an element of subtext, I'd capture it. I filled 2 notebooks over the course of 2 months, documentation of the systematic dismantling of my position and authority. On a Tuesday morning in May, I was sitting at my desk going through emails when I found a message from the HR director, Patricia Chun, Thomas's aunt, which I found out months later, asking if I had time for a wellness check. That phrase, wellness check, in corporate environments, doesn't actually mean they're concerned about your wellness. It means they've noticed you're showing signs of distress and they want to document that they noticed. It's insurance. It's them creating a record that says, "We saw that he was struggling, and we tried to help." It's the beginning of the end. I went to Patricia's office on the 39th floor. She had photos of her family on her desk, including several of Thomas at various ages. She was warm when I came in, offered me coffee, asked me how I was doing. "I'm doing well," I lied. "Adjusting to the new role, but doing well." "That's good to hear," she said. "We just want to make sure everyone is supported during periods of transition. Change can be stressful, and we want to make sure our executives have the resources they need to manage that stress effectively." What she was actually saying was, "We're monitoring you, and we're documenting that you're handling the stress. If you're not handling it well, that will become part of your file." She told me about the company's wellness programs, gym membership subsidies, counseling services, meditation apps, all the corporate-approved ways to manage the destruction of your career without actually addressing the fact that your career is being destroyed. She asked if I had anyone I could talk to about what I was experiencing. I didn't mention that I could call my ex-wife, that Sandra would probably listen and understand in a way that nobody else could, because that would be admitting that I had lost my marriage and was now losing my career, and that I felt like I was 65 and used up instead of 52. "I'm fine," I told her. "Really? just a lot of moving pieces to manage." "I know," she said sympathetically. "And you're doing a great job with the transition. I know Rothstein is really pleased with how you're handling it." This made me want to laugh in a way that would have been inappropriate. Rothstein was pleased because I was handling the dismantling of my own position without complaint. I was pleased because the most likely outcome at this point was that they'd forced me out within a year, and they'd look like they tried to help me along the way. I left Patricia's office and walked back to mine, and somewhere between the 39th floor and the 42nd floor, I made a decision. I decided I wasn't going to go quietly. I decided that I'd spent 32 years building a career at Whitmore, and I wasn't going to let it be erased through corporate sleight of hand. I decided that what was happening to me was wrong and that I needed to do something about it. The first step was understanding exactly what was happening. The second step was gathering evidence. The third step, which I didn't let myself think about yet, was deciding what to do with that evidence once I had it. I started investigating Thomas's background more carefully. I had access to company records, and I began reviewing his hiring file, his contracts, his project submissions. What I found was interesting. Thomas had been hired by Rothstein directly, with an unusually high starting salary, with a signing bonus that was significantly larger than was typical for his position. His role description was vague in a way that suggested it was being created for him specifically, rather than him being hired to fill an existing need. These things weren't necessarily red flags individually, but together they suggested that Thomas had been brought in for a specific purpose, and that purpose was almost certainly to modernize the company, which really meant to eliminate people like me. I started looking at his work more carefully, which is how I discovered the first real problem. One of his projects, which he presented to the executive team as original research into machine learning applications for operations, was nearly identical to a presentation that had been given by a consultant that Whitmore had hired 3 years ago. The consultant's name was buried in the files, but the work was almost certainly the same. Thomas had essentially repackaged someone else's research as his own, added some graphics, and presented it as his original thinking. This wasn't necessarily illegal. It wasn't necessarily even inappropriate in corporate environments, where intellectual property is often murky and where presentations are often aggregations of multiple sources. But it was deceptive. It was presenting himself as having a depth of understanding that he didn't actually have. It was lying, essentially. I copied the files, both the consultant's original work and Thomas's presentation. I stored them in a secure folder on my personal device. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with them yet, but I wanted to have them. Over the next few weeks, I started having conversations with people who'd been at the company longer than Thomas, people who might have insights into what was actually happening. There's always an informal network of these people, not old people, necessarily, but people with institutional memory, people who understand the company in a way that goes beyond the official story. My first real conversation was with Robert Martinez, who'd worked in IT operations for over 20 years before being moved into an advisory position about a year ago. I recognized the pattern immediately. Robert had been demoted disguised as a lateral move, had been pushed to the side in exactly the way I was being pushed to the side now. I ran into Robert at the coffee shop in the building lobby. He was ordering a cappuccino at the small Caffè Nero that everyone at Whitmore uses, the one that's overpriced and mediocre, but provides a neutral meeting ground where conversations feel less formal than at the office. I ordered a coffee and sat at the small table with him without asking permission, which broke a kind of social protocol but seemed justified given the circumstances. "How's the new role treating you?" Robert asked me. He said it with the specific tone of someone who knows exactly what the new role is doing to you because it's already been done to him. "It's been complicated," I said carefully. "More complicated than I expected when I accepted the promotion." Robert nodded slowly, like I just confirmed something he'd suspected. "Yeah," he said. "That's what they do. They promote you, give you a big title, let you think for a few weeks that you've actually made it, and then they systematically remove all your actual authority. By the time you figure out what's happened, you're already committed to the position, and you can't really complain about it without looking like you're ungrateful or can't handle the responsibility. How long did it take you to figure it out? I asked him. About 2 months, he said, and I made the mistake of pushing back. I complained to Rothstein about decisions being made about my area that I wasn't consulted about, and that was the kiss of death. Within 6 months, I was in my current position, which is basically a holding pattern until I decide to leave. So what are you doing? I asked. Are you looking for something else? I was, Robert said, but I'm 59 years old, Harrison. I have health insurance through Whitmore. I have a pension that I'm not eligible to fully access for 6 more years. I have a daughter who's getting married next year. I can't afford to leave. So I'm doing the thing that a lot of us do. I'm waiting. I'm getting close enough to retirement that leaving becomes viable. And in the meantime, I'm learning not to care about things I can't control. This was probably meant to be comforting advice, but it terrified me. The idea that my options had been reduced to essentially waiting for retirement that felt impossibly far away, waiting for time to pass, waiting for my life to end essentially, was more frightening than anything that had happened yet. I was a man who believed in action, in moving forward, in controlling his own narrative. Being told that my best option was to essentially give up was devastating in a way I hadn't anticipated. There has to be something else, I said. Robert looked at me carefully. There's always something else, he said. But the something else usually involves standing up to them about what's happening. And that usually ends with you being forced out anyway, except now on their terms instead of slowly and carefully. He took a sip of his cappuccino. I mean, look, if you want to fight it, you can fight it. Go to Rothstein. Show him that the way operations is being restructured is fundamentally limiting your ability to do your job. Make a case for why that's bad for the company. Some people do that. Some people even win. But most people, when they try that, find that they've made the company uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people tend to get pushed out faster. After I left Robert, I sat in my car for about an hour before driving back to my apartment. My apartment is in the Upper West Side, a 1-bedroom that I downsized to after the divorce, a space that's efficient and lonely in roughly equal measure. I sat on my couch in the dark and tried to understand what had actually happened to my life, tried to map the moment where things had started going wrong. Was it the promotion itself? Was it years earlier, when I decided to prioritize my career over my marriage? When I decided that climbing was more important than being present? Was it the moment I turned 50, when I started to become less visible to the corporate world? Was it the moment I was born into a world where what you're worth is determined by what you can produce, by whether you're still climbing, or whether you're starting to slip? The next morning I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my son Michael. He was in Portland, 3 hours behind, so it was early on the West Coast when I called. He answered sounding confused, which was fair because I don't call very often anymore. "Dad," he said, "is everything okay?" "Yes," I said. "Everything's fine. I just wanted to talk to you." "How have you been?" There was a pause. Then, "I'm good. Work's good, girlfriend's good, everything's good. How are you?" I wanted to tell him the truth. I wanted to tell him that I'd just been promoted to a position that was designed to marginalize me, that the company I'd worked for 15 years had essentially decided I was obsolete, that I was watching my career end before I was actually old enough to retire, that I was facing the reality that I had sacrificed my time with him, time I could never get back for a career that had treated that sacrifice as nothing more than what was expected. I wanted to tell him that I regretted the choices I'd made, that I regretted not being more present, that I understood now why his mother had left me, that I understood now that I'd been so focused on climbing that I'd missed his entire childhood. "I'm good too," I said instead. "Just wanted to check in. How's the new apartment working out?" We talked for about 10 minutes. a conversation that had the shape of connection but lacked the actual substance of it. I asked him questions about his work and his girlfriend, and he answered them politely, and the whole thing felt like we were both acting roles we'd memorized long ago. When we hung up, I felt worse instead of better. I'd thought talking to him would help, but instead it had just highlighted how much distance there was between us, how much I'd missed by being somewhere else. I went to work that day and participated in meetings where decisions were made about my areas of responsibility without my input. I reviewed emails about the technology initiatives that were being implemented without my consultation. I did the job I'd been elevated to and then systematically stripped of actual authority. And underneath all of that, I was making calculations. I was deciding what I was willing to do about what was happening. By the beginning of June, I had a plan. It wasn't a particularly sophisticated plan, and it wasn't a plan I was proud of, but it was a plan. I had documentation of Thomas plagiarizing research. I had evidence of the systematic removal of my authority from a position I'd been elevated to less than 2 months prior. I had testimony from Robert Martinez and several other longer-term employees about how the company had a pattern of promoting older workers into diminished positions. What I didn't have was a clear understanding of what I was going to do with all of this information or what outcome I was hoping for. I think what I wanted, fundamentally, was acknowledgement. I wanted someone to acknowledge that what was happening was wrong, that the way I was being treated was not just business as usual, but was actually a deliberate strategy to sideline me. I wanted my experience to matter, to count for something, to not just be absorbed into the machine like it was nothing. This is the part of the story where I should have been smarter. This is the part where I should have recognized that I was operating from a place of wounded pride and fear, not from a place of strategic thinking. This is the part where I should have listened to Robert's advice about the danger of making yourself uncomfortable to the organization. But I didn't. Instead, I scheduled a meeting with David Rothstein. I told his assistant that I wanted to discuss the direction of the operations division and how I could better support the strategic goals of the organization. His assistant gave me a slot on his calendar for Friday afternoon, which I took as a good sign. I didn't know yet that when people are about to push you out, they accommodate your schedule because they're trying to avoid conflict. Thursday night, I reviewed my documentation one more time. I had copies of Thomas's presentation and the original consultant research. I had a detailed timeline of when decisions had been made about my areas without my input. I had the email chains where discussions about new initiatives were happening between Rothstein, Thomas, and Rebecca, with me conspicuously absent. I had everything I needed to make a case that something was wrong. What I didn't have was any sense that going into that meeting was probably the biggest mistake I was about to make. Friday afternoon, I walked into David Rothstein's office at 4 o'clock. His office is on the 45th floor, the top floor of the building, with a view that encompasses most of the city. He stands a lot while he's in his office, so when I walked in, he was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city like he owned it. He's 6'3", probably 58 years old, fit in the way that wealthy people are fit, with personal trainers and nutritionists who've been engineering his physical form for years. He's been the CEO for 7 years, and before that he was CFO, and before that he was at Goldman Sachs. He's the kind of man who's been climbing for his entire life and has never stopped. He's probably never experienced the moment where climbing stops being available as an option. "Harrison," he said, turning away from the window and smiling. "Come in. I'm really glad you wanted to meet." We sat down, and he offered me water or coffee, things I declined. I was already terrified, and I didn't want to show it through the small tremor that I knew would show up in any drinks I tried to hold. "I wanted to talk about the direction the operations division is heading," I started, "and about my role in that direction." "Of course," Rothstein said. "What's on your mind?" "I'm concerned," I said carefully, "that the operational structure that's been implemented is limiting my ability to effectively execute the mandate I was hired to fulfill. I'm not being consulted on major decisions within my purview. I'm not being given access to the information I need to understand the direction we're moving in. And I have documentation of several instances where that's happened. I pulled out the files. I showed him the comparison between Thomas's presentation and the original consultant research. I walked through the timeline of meetings I wasn't invited to. I made my case carefully and thoroughly, the way I'd been trained to make cases after 15 years in this organization. Rothstein listened to all of it without interrupting. When I was finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Harrison," he said, "I appreciate you bringing this to me directly. I want to be really clear about something. Your role in this organization is to manage the human aspects of operational transition. That's exactly what we brought you in to do. We have very specific strategic initiatives around technology and process optimization that fall outside of that mandate. That's not you being excluded. That's just a clear delineation of responsibility." "But that delineation wasn't part of my job description," I said. "When I accepted this position, I was told I was going to be Senior Vice President of Operations, which should include strategic initiatives around operations." "Right," Rothstein said. "And you are the Senior Vice President of Operations. But operations includes strategy, and strategy in the modern context includes technology and process modernization, and that's just a different domain than the human and cultural work that you're uniquely positioned to do." What he had just done was repackage the exact problem I was identifying and present it back to me as if it was something I should have understood all along. He was saying that being excluded from decisions was actually just me having a specialized role. He was saying that my concern about not being consulted was actually me misunderstanding my own job. "I have concerns," I said, and I could hear my voice starting to get louder, could feel the controlled tone slipping, about decisions being made within my division without my input. "I have concerns about strategic initiatives that should fall under operations being moved outside of my purview. And I have concerns about the way this was represented to me when I accepted the promotion." "I hear you," Rothstein said. And then he did something that I now understand was the moment he decided to move me out of the company. He stood up. "But I think what's happening here is that you're reacting to a change in the business structure without fully understanding why that change is happening. We're in the middle of a significant modernization initiative. It's disruptive. It's uncomfortable. And people who've been in traditional roles are sometimes uncomfortable with how radically the work is changing. That's normal. That's expected. But what I need from my executives is flexibility and openness to that kind of change. And this," he gestured to the files I'd brought, "this feels more like resistance than openness." "I'm not resisting change," I said. "I'm asking for clarity about my role and my authority. And I'm giving you that clarity," Rothstein said. "Your role is to lead the transition. Your authority is in how you manage that transition. That's significant. That's important. But I need you to approach it with a mindset of leading people through change, not of protecting your territory." He was framing my concerns about being systematically stripped of authority as territorial and obstructive. He was redefining the entire conversation so that my objections became evidence of the problem he'd identified, that I was someone uncomfortable with change, someone who couldn't adapt, someone who was trying to protect the old way of doing things. "I understand," I said. I said it because I didn't know what else to say, because I was realizing with a kind of sick certainty that I'd made a mistake. I'd opened the door and shown him that I understood what was happening, and in doing so, I'd made myself a problem that needed to be managed. "Good," he said. "I'm glad we talked about this. I think this actually clarifies things. And I do appreciate your commitment to making this work, really. But what I heard was, I now have a clear understanding that you're a threat to the narrative we're building, and I need to figure out how to get you out of the company without it looking like we're getting you out of the company." I left his office and went back to my apartment instead of finishing my workday. I sat on my couch and tried to understand what I'd just done. I'd walked into his office with documentation of problems, thinking that evidence would be compelling, thinking that if I could just explain clearly enough what was happening, he would fix it. What I'd actually done was walked into his office and shown him the precise angle from which he needed to attack in order to neutralize me. I didn't go to work on Monday. I called in sick, which was the first time I'd done that since accepting the promotion. My body wasn't cooperating with pretense anymore. I had a tension headache that started at the base of my skull and extended down my spine, the kind of physical manifestation of stress that makes you wonder if something is actually wrong or if you're just aging in real time. I spent Monday calling lawyers. I wanted to understand my options, what protections I had, whether what was happening to me constituted anything actionable. The lawyers I spoke to were uniformly pessimistic. Without documentation of explicit age discrimination or other legally protected discrimination, without a severance offer that seemed unreasonable, without clear evidence of bad faith, I didn't have much of a case. One lawyer told me that what I was describing, removal of authority from a position, changes in role definition, was technically feasible, technically defensible, and would be nearly impossible to prove was discriminatory without a paper trail that explicitly referenced my age or any other protected characteristic. They're too sophisticated for that, the lawyer told me. Companies don't put in writing that they're eliminating roles because the people in them are too old. They just restructure around them, create new titles, redefine responsibilities, and then eventually the person leaves or they find a reason to fire them for performance issues that emerged in the restructured role. I asked him if I could take any legal action. You could file a complaint with the EEOC, he said. But if I'm being honest, you probably won't win. And in the meantime, you'd be poisoning your relationships at the company, which probably wouldn't matter if you were planning to leave anyway, but if you want to stay, it would definitely make your life there worse. After all the lawyer calls, I sat in my apartment and tried to calculate my options. I could take my complaints to the EEOC, knowing I'd probably lose and in the process make myself radioactive at the company. I could document everything and try to build a case for legal action, which would take months or years and likely fail anyway. I could quietly accept what was happening and start looking for a job elsewhere, knowing that at 52 I was probably less employable than I wanted to admit. Or I could try one more thing. I could go to the board of directors. Whitmore Financial has a board, as all companies do, with 12 members. Mostly wealthy people who got onto boards because they were already wealthy or connected or both. One of them was a woman named Margaret Sullivan, who I'd met at several company events. Margaret had spent 30 years in corporate leadership before stepping down to take on board positions. She had, as far as I knew, a reputation for caring about corporate culture and ethics. She had given a speech at a company event once about the importance of valuing employees and creating environments where people could grow. This might have been naive of me, but I thought that if I could reach Margaret, if I could explain what was happening, she might actually care. I found her email through a company directory. I sent her a carefully worded message asking if she had time for a brief conversation about some concerns I had regarding operational practices at Whitmore. I didn't say anything specific, didn't make accusations, just indicated that I had concerns and that I valued her perspective on corporate leadership. She responded the next day, offering to meet with me on Wednesday afternoon at a coffee shop near her office in Midtown. I would find out later that this meeting, this reaching out to a board member, was the thing that really set the timeline for what came next. Reaching directly to the board bypassed the entire corporate hierarchy. It was, in corporate terms, essentially a declaration of war. Wednesday afternoon, I met Margaret Sullivan at a Starbucks on 57th Street. She's about 65 years old, sharp in a way that you can just see in the way she sits and listens. She ordered a tea and we found a table in the corner. "Tell me what's going on," she said simply. So I did. I told her about the promotion, about the systematic removal of authority, about being excluded from strategic decisions within my purview, about the way the role had been restructured to diminish my actual power while maintaining the appearance of authority. I told her about the research that Thomas had plagiarized and presented as his own. I told her about the conversations with Robert Martinez about the pattern of promoting older workers into diminished positions. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I was finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "This sounds like a significant management problem," she said carefully. "Do you have documentation of all of this?" "I do," I said. "I have copies of the plagiarized research. I have the timeline of decisions made without my input. I have testimony from other long-term employees about similar experiences." "And you've tried discussing this with Rothstein?" she asked. "I have," I said. And his response was to suggest that I was being territorial and resistant to change, and to reframe my concerns about being excluded as evidence of the problem rather than the problem itself. Margaret was quiet again. "Harrison," she said, "I appreciate you bringing this to me. I do, but I need to be honest with you. Going to the board about this is a significant step. And while what you're describing sounds concerning, it's also the kind of thing that, once it's formally raised to the board level, creates pressure on the company to respond decisively. And very often, the way companies respond to that kind of pressure is not by fixing the problem, but by removing the person who brought it to their attention. So what are you saying?" I asked her. "I'm saying that I'll take this to the board and we'll investigate, and we'll ask Rothstein to explain what's happening with the operations division. But I want to be clear with you that doing this may accelerate the timeline for your departure from Whitmore." "That's not certain, but it's likely." I sat with that for a moment. "So my options are," I said slowly, "accept what's happening and slowly be forced out anyway, or fight it and be forced out faster." "Essentially, yes," Margaret said, "though there is a third option. You could go directly to Rothstein and tell him that you're going to the board. Give him a chance to address the problems before it becomes a formal board issue. But that also carries risk because you're essentially threatening the company, and companies don't respond well to threats. So there's really no good option," I said. "There might be one," Margaret said. "You could resign. You could take the current title and comp and then engage an employment lawyer to negotiate an exit package that reflects your tenure and your seniority. It would probably be a fairly substantial package if you play it right. And then you could leave on somewhat better terms than if you fight it and lose." What she was describing was essentially surrender with dignity. It was accepting that I'd lost and trying to minimize the damage in the process. And there's probably a version of my life where I did exactly that. There's probably a version where I took the meeting with Margaret as a sign that fighting back was futile, and I started negotiating my exit immediately. But I didn't do that. Instead, I told Margaret to tell the board. I told her to formally investigate. I told her that I'd been at this company for 15 years, and I wasn't going to leave quietly. "All right," she said. "I'll bring it up at the next board meeting, which is 2 weeks from now. In the meantime, I'd suggest you prepare for the possibility that things are going to get worse before they get better. And you might want to talk to an employment lawyer about what your options are if they do decide to accelerate your departure." I left that coffee shop feeling like I'd just thrown a match into a warehouse full of gasoline. I'd done the thing that Robert had warned me about. I'd made myself a problem that the organization would now need to manage, and organizations are very good at managing problems. What happened over the next 2 weeks was a masterclass in corporate pressure. Rothstein didn't confront me directly. Instead, he just stopped including me in things. Meetings that I used to attend happened without me. Emails that I used to be copied on suddenly went out with different distribution lists. People I'd worked with for years became distant. At one meeting that I did attend, Thomas presented an update on the operational initiatives, and Rothstein specifically praised his work while making a comment about ensuring that we have the right people leading the charge on the important initiatives. The message was clear. You're no longer a person leading the charge on important initiatives. You're something else now, something less. I also got called into a meeting with Patricia Chun from HR. This time she wasn't warm and supportive. This time she was clinical, documenting. She told me that they'd received reports that I was disengaging from responsibilities and undermining the management structure. I asked her what specifically I was doing that was undermining the management structure. She said it was reported that I had raised concerns about operational decisions with board members without going through proper channels. There it was. They knew I'd gone to Margaret. They knew I'd gone to the board. Those were just conversations about corporate governance, I said carefully. I was seeking perspective on best practices. That's fine, Patricia said. But we need to ensure that operational concerns stay within the operational chain of command. Going outside the chain of command can create confusion about authority and decision-making. What she was really saying was, we know you're trying to circumvent us, and we're documenting that you've done that, and we're going to use it against you. That night, I called Michael again. This time, I didn't ask how he was doing. This time I said, I'm going to be going through something in the next few months. I don't want you to hear it from someone else. I'm having difficulties at work, and things are probably going to change. But I want you to know that none of it has to do with anything you did or anything you didn't do. It's a situation with my employment. Dad, Michael said, and I could hear concern in his voice. Are you okay? I will be, I said. I'm just trying to navigate something complicated. But I wanted you to know what's happening. There was a pause. Then, is there anything I can do? Not really, I said. I just wanted you to know, and I love you. I don't say that enough, and I wanted to say it now. When we hung up, I felt slightly better. Not better in the sense that my situation had improved, but better in the sense that I'd taken a small action toward being more present with my son, toward being honest with him about what was happening in my life instead of just pretending everything was fine. The board meeting happened on a Thursday. Margaret called me that evening. The board investigated, she said without preamble. We looked into the operational structure, the way your role has been defined, the research that your colleague presented, and the board has formally requested that Rothstein provide a detailed explanation of how the operations division is structured and why your authority has been limited. What does that mean? I asked. It means Rothstein is now in a position where he has to justify his decisions to the board, Margaret said. And very often when CEOs have to justify decisions to the board, they do one of two things. They either fix the problem or they eliminate the person who is causing them the problem. So I'm probably going to be fired, I said. Not necessarily fired, Margaret said, but you're probably going to be forced to leave one way or another. I'm sorry, Harrison. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. After I hung up with Margaret, I sat on my couch and allowed myself to fully absorb what was happening. I'd fought back, and the organization was now moving to push me out. It was happening faster than it would have if I'd just gone quietly. Faster than it would have if I'd accepted Robert's advice and learned to not care about things I couldn't control. I'd made my situation worse through my resistance. But here's the thing. At least I'd tried. At least I'd refused to accept the narrative that what was happening was just business as usual. At least I'd stood up and said that something was wrong and that wanted acknowledgement of that wrongness. Maybe that was stupid. Maybe that was the mistake of a 52-year-old man who couldn't accept that his time of being valuable had passed. But it was my choice, and I'd made it with my eyes open. The call from Rothstein came on Monday morning. He wanted to meet at 5 o'clock. I went to his office at 4:55 p.m., and when I walked in, I could tell that the nature of our relationship had fundamentally changed. He wasn't warm anymore. He was formal, and there was something else there too, something like pity, but not quite. Maybe it was relief. Harrison, he said, I need to talk to you about your future at Whitmore. We sat down, and he explained, with corporate precision, that the company had decided to move in a different strategic direction and that this new direction wouldn't require the same operational structure that I was currently overseeing. He explained that they were offering me a severance package, 6 months of pay, extension of my health insurance, and a small pension adjustment. He explained that in exchange for accepting this package, I would be required to sign a non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreement that would prevent me from discussing my departure or what had led to it. "I'm being fired," I said. "You're being offered a generous severance package," Rothstein said, "that reflects your tenure and seniority at the company. I'd encourage you to view it as an opportunity for transition and reflection rather than as a termination." What I wanted to say was, I'm being pushed out because I was the wrong age for the company you want to be, because I represented the past instead of the future, because I had the audacity to push back against being systematically marginalized. I'm being pushed out because I'm 52 years old and the company decided that 52 is too old to be valuable anymore, even though you can't say that explicitly, even though you have to create a narrative that doesn't mention age or discrimination or anything that could actually describe what's happening. What I actually said was, I need to discuss this with an employment lawyer. Of course, Rothstein said. You have until Friday to let me know if you're accepting the package. After Friday, we'll need to consider other options. What he meant was that if I didn't accept the voluntary severance, they would probably fire me for cause, or create circumstances that forced me to resign or otherwise remove me from the company in a way that would be less favorable. The offer was generous by corporate standards, and the threat underneath it was clear. I spent the rest of that week in a kind of fog. I called the employment lawyer I'd spoken with before and told him what was happening. He reviewed the severance package and told me it was actually quite good, the equivalent of about 4 months extra pay beyond the base severance, plus an extension of health insurance. You could push back, he said, but you'd probably lose, and in the meantime you'd drain your savings on legal fees. I'd recommend you take it. I accepted the severance on Friday morning. I walked into a conference room with Rothstein, Patricia Chun, and a representative from legal, and I signed the documents that ended my 15-year career at Whitmore Financial. I was offered 2 choices. I could leave immediately with my severance, or I could stay through the end of the month in a transition capacity. I chose to leave immediately. I couldn't imagine going back to that office, being watched, having my departure dragged out. When I left the building that Friday afternoon, I walked out into a June day that was beautiful and warm, and the disconnect between the outside weather and my internal state was almost comical. The sun was shining. People were moving through the city with purpose and direction, and I was walking out into that scene as a 52-year-old man without a job, without a clear sense of what came next, with a severance package that would sustain me for a few months but not indefinitely. I didn't go directly home. Instead, I drove up to the Bronx, to a park that Michael and I used to go to when he was 8 or 9 years old. We'd come here on weekends, and he'd run around while I'd sit on a bench and read or work or just think. I hadn't been there in probably 15 years, since Michael stopped wanting to spend time with his aging father in parks. But I wanted to go back to sit in that same physical space and try to understand the person I'd been the last time I was. They're a younger man with a child who still wanted to spend time with him, with a career that still felt like it was going somewhere. The park was mostly the same, though there was new playground equipment and the trees had grown taller. I sat on a bench similar to the one I used to sit on, and I allowed myself to fully acknowledge the failure. I'd spent 32 years climbing. I'd sacrificed my marriage and my presence in my son's life. I'd focused relentlessly on work, on advancement, on building a career. And it had all been for nothing, because at 52, I discovered that I was obsolete anyway, that the 15 years I'd invested in Whitmore meant nothing when the company decided it was time to move in a different direction, that the person I'd become single, distant from my son, defined entirely by my work, had been built on a foundation that never actually existed. What the promotion had revealed was the fundamental fragility of my entire life. I'd assumed that if I continued climbing, if I kept advancing, I'd reach a point where I was secure, where I could relax, where I could enjoy the fruits of all that labor. But the labor never ended, and the security never came. Instead, there was always another level to reach for, always another person climbing faster, always the awareness that you were getting older and that the people replacing you were younger and more technically proficient and cheaper. I spent the next few months in what I can only describe as a form of controlled depression. I wasn't suicidal. I wasn't unable to function. But I was fundamentally listless, drifting. I collected unemployment. I went to the gym. I called Michael occasionally. I went to therapy, which was something I should have done decades ago, but didn't. My therapist, Dr. Pauline Okafor, was in her 60s, and she had a specific way of asking questions that forced you to confront uncomfortable truths about yourself. What were you getting from the career? She asked me in one session. That you couldn't get anywhere else? Identity, I said immediately. I got my identity from the work, from climbing, from being good at what I did. And who were you when you weren't climbing? She asked. I didn't know, I said. I still don't know. That's the thing, Dr. Okafor said, that I think you need to figure out. Because the climbing has stopped now, Harrison. The career ladder doesn't extend any higher for you. And you're going to spend the next 20 or 30 years as yourself, not as your job. So you need to figure out who that is. This was more useful than 1,000 HR wellness programs. This was actually approaching the problem that needed to be approached. That I'd built an entire identity on a career that was now over, and I had no idea who I was without it. I started spending more time with Michael. I drove to Portland in July and stayed for a week. It was the first time I'd really spent extended time with him in probably 5 years. We didn't do anything particularly remarkable. We went to restaurants. We took walks. I met his girlfriend, whose name is Sarah, and who seemed significantly smarter and kinder than my son deserved. Or maybe I mean that my son seemed smarter and kinder than I'd given him credit for. I realized while I was there that my son is an adult. He's not the child I was neglecting anymore. He's a 30-year-old man who has built a life that doesn't include me very much, and that's actually fine. That's not failure on either of our parts. That's just what happens when a parent chooses to be absent, and eventually the child learns not to expect them to be present. On the last day of my visit, Michael and I were sitting in a coffee shop, and he asked me about my job situation. I told him what happened as honestly as I could. He listened without interrupting, and then he said, "You know, Dad, the thing I remember most about when I was growing up is that you were always somewhere else. Like, even when you were physically present, you were thinking about work, and I used to resent that. I used to feel like I wasn't important enough to get your full attention. But I think now that I get older, I realize that you were probably struggling. You were probably trying to figure out how to be the person you thought you needed to be." "I was," I said. "And I was wrong to make you pay for that." "Yeah," Michael said. "You were. But you're here now, and that's something. You're here now, and you're not thinking about work, because there's no work to think about." He was right. The loss of my career had actually freed me to be present in a way I hadn't been in probably 30 years. I could sit in a coffee shop with my son, and I could be in that moment, and there was nothing else competing for my attention because I had no career to compete for my attention. I went back to New York at the end of July, and I spent the rest of the summer thinking about what came next. I didn't want to go back into corporate work. The severance had given me about 8 months of runway, which was enough time to figure out my next move if I was strategic about it. I started thinking about consulting work, freelance operations strategy, the kind of thing that would let me use the expertise I built over 15 years without being subject to the same kind of corporate pressure and ageism. In August, I ran into Robert Martinez at the same coffee shop where we'd talked before. I told him what had happened, and he was unsurprised. "They burned you out," he said simply. You pushed back, and they decided you were too much trouble to keep around. That's how it usually ends. Do you regret staying? I asked him. Every day, he said, but I also can't afford to leave. So I stay, and I collect my paychecks, and I tried to find meaning in other parts of my life. What I should have done is what you did. I should have fought back harder, gotten pushed out, taken the severance, and moved on to something else. But I was afraid, and so I stayed, and now I'm older and still afraid, and I'll probably stay until I retire. It's not too late for you, I said. Yes, it is, Robert said. I'm 59. I'm not going to start over somewhere else, but I'm glad you're getting out. I'm glad you're not going to spend the next 10 years doing what I'm doing. By September, I'd gotten a few consulting projects. Companies wanted my expertise in operations strategy, and they were willing to pay for it without making me an employee. Without making me subject to the corporate machinery that I'd discovered was designed to discard people like me. It was less money than Whitmore had paid, but it was flexible, and it was something. What I realized over the fall was that what had felt like the worst thing being forced out of the promotion I'd waited for my entire career was actually the best thing that could have happened to me. If I'd stayed, I would have probably lasted another year or two in a position designed to make me ineffective, and then they would have pushed me out anyway. But I would have spent that time in a state of grinding despair, aware that I was being pushed out but unable to stop it. By fighting back, by going to the board, by refusing to go quietly, I'd shortened the timeline and forced the company to show me what it actually thought of me, which was something clarifying. What the promotion had revealed was the truth that corporate loyalty is one-directional. You're supposed to be loyal to the company, to sacrifice for it, to put it ahead of other things in your life. But the company has no loyalty to you. It will keep you as long as you're useful, and the moment you're not useful, which, it turned out, was much sooner than I'd expected for someone my age, it will discard you. This is not a revolutionary thought. This is not a particularly unique insight. But it hits differently when it happens to you, when you're the one being discarded. I'm writing this now, almost a year after I left Whitmore. I'm 53 years old. I'm making decent money through consulting work. I'm in therapy, which is helping me figure out who I am outside of a job title. I'm spending more time with Michael, and we've built a relationship that, while not perfectly close, is at least genuine. I'm no longer married, and I've stopped trying to be married. I've made peace with the fact that my marriage ended because I chose a career over my wife, and that was a choice with consequences. But more than anything else, what I've come to understand is that the promotion wasn't the worst thing that happened to me. The promotion was actually a gift. It showed me what I needed to see. It showed me that the 32 years I'd spent climbing had been spent climbing towards something that didn't actually exist. It showed me that I'd sacrificed real things, my marriage, my presence in my son's childhood, my ability to just be a person without constantly achieving for something that was going to be taken away. Anyway, the moment I stopped being economically useful, the worst thing was the time I spent climbing. The worst thing was the years where I chose work over everything else, thinking that eventually it would pay off, thinking that eventually I'd reach a level where I could relax. The worst thing was becoming a person whose only identity was his job, so that when the job was taken away, there was almost nothing left. The promotion I waited for my entire career turned out to be the worst because it revealed that the career I'd been building was built on the lie that loyalty would be rewarded, that climbing would eventually lead somewhere secure, that sacrificing your life for work was a reasonable exchange for the security and validation that work provided. But work doesn't provide security. It just provides the illusion of security right up until it doesn't. And by the time you figure that out, you've already spent 30 years building an identity on that illusion. I'm not bitter about what happened. I mean, I am bitter, but I'm also grateful for the experience of bitterness, because it forced me to confront some fundamental truths about the choices I've made and the kind of person I want to be going forward. I'm 53 years old. Maybe I have 30 more years ahead of me. Maybe I have 5. I don't know. But whatever time I have left, I'm going to spend it trying to be present in my own life instead of constantly chasing the next thing, the next level, the next validation. That's the real promotion, if you can even call it that. The elevation from being a person who works to being a person who just lives. It took getting pushed out of a corporate hierarchy to teach me that. It took being discarded to teach me that I was worth more than what I could produce. It took losing everything to understand what actually mattered. The promotion I waited for my entire career turned out to be the worst, but losing it turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. That's the twist that corporate life doesn't usually prepare you for. That's the story they don't tell you when you're climbing. That sometimes the thing you think you're losing is actually the thing that's been weighing you down. And sometimes you don't understand that until it's gone and you finally get to breathe.